Okay, so for today, we've come quite a long way from economic models and impact assessments of ICT over HCI and the potential fictional ideas for improving our field. We want to finish before lunch, but not for today, only until lunch, with a final talk on AI ethics, actually. So we are happy to have a speaker present, that is Nguyen Hoang from EPFL Lausanne. And the floor is yours. Thanks a lot for your presentation already. That one? I think you can use that one as well. Whatever you prefer.
Well, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm very glad to be here talking about a project that is trying to address AI ethics. But before getting to this, I want to stress the problem. I think maybe in our field, like in information and computer science and communication technology, sorry, we tend to forget that what we are doing, the main role of what we're producing is eventually to have tools that are going to communicate information. And this is very important because our society is highly dependent on the quality of information that is spread. You can imagine a society where every time an information is spread, it is a quality piece of information, then maybe things will go a lot better than if disinformation or misinformation is consistently spread. So that's really the problem I want to focus on. And if you think about this, in terms of information, like some of Google in particular has come to play an increasingly important role, in a role that's disproportionately important compared to previous technologies of information. And on Google, there's a lot of things happening, but probably a lot of people are actually searching things about climate change. And a lot of the current fight against climate change is happening right here on Google whenever someone is asking a question to Google. So typically, you can ask what happens when someone searches, is climate change a hoax on Google? What would be the website that Google will tell its users to be looking at? And I highly recommend to do the experiments once in a while on Google, and you'll see, interestingly, that the first recommendations are all essentially explaining the scientific consensus. So I think I've done this research with an ad block, but what's interesting is sometimes as well you see ads that are actually saying that climate change is not a hoax, that are going with the scientific consensus. And so Google is actually pretty good about this, but if you try other search engines, like for instance, Microsoft Bing, then you can see, well, there is something about Wikipedia here that is going to explain the scientific consensus, but like the first recommendation here is actually something that is arguing that climate change is a hoax. So if you think of Bing users, then whenever they're searching about climate change and whether it is a hoax, then the first recommendation that they have, the first answer that is given by Microsoft Bing is actually misinformation, probably even like a disinformation, maybe the result of some disinformation campaign. So this is, I think this is Yahoo, I'm not even sure, but you can see that on this other search engine, the first answer is climate change is a lie, so it's against the scientific consensus. And if you search on DuckDuckGo, again, you have something that is against the scientific consensus. It's the same first result as on Bing. And so you're seeing that if people are searching for information on many of the search engines, then actually they get disinformation. They get something that will hinder the fight against climate change. And this is a very big issue because it's influencing billions of users that are then going to influence what politicians are going to defend, especially in democracies. And this will have all sorts of bad consequences, of course. So again, this is Ecosia, which is a search engine that is pro-environmental and that is like donating to plant trees whenever you do a search. You see that the first result is a climate denialist result. Of course, those people who are using Ecosia are probably not searching this kind of queries, but you still see that if you don't do anything actually, then this information is going to be recommended at least to many people. In fact, the fact that Google is the one exception is not an accident. In 2019, Google and YouTube have announced that they were going to combat disinformation, especially on topics like climate change. So if you don't do anything, you're not being proactive about trying to have robustly beneficial results to queries like this, then the result is not going to be robustly beneficial. In fact, if you think about this, there are lots of incentives from many companies to promote disinformation and to make sure that what is going to be recommended by these algorithms is going to go their ways rather than the scientific consensus or some other ways. It's known fact that there have been a lot of investments from many companies in disinformation campaigns. And there are lots of investments from a lot of companies in what is called the search engine optimization, namely trying to appear on top in these recommendations. So if you don't do anything, it's not going to be solved by itself. You're going to have a lot of disinformation. Unfortunately, we've seen this with a lot of topics. So I can take the case of vaccination. If someone is searching vaccination kills, for instance, on YouTube, you can really think of this as a dilemma. What is the algorithm going to recommend? It's not an easy question. Even if you know the scientific consensus, it's still a very difficult question to know what video should be recommended. And then it's not different from what's happening when somebody in your, like maybe your uncle or maybe a friend of yours, is telling you that vaccination kills, and you have to answer something. What are you going to answer? This is a very difficult, very challenging question, and I know it for a fact because I create YouTube videos, and I always have to think a lot about what is the best way to present the scientific consensus. Is it going to be a factual exposition of some scientific paper? Is it going to be through fiction, maybe? Or is it by telling the story of someone? Or is it by showing the right statistics or presenting it in a pedagogical way? It's really, really not easy. And in fact, in the beginning of the COVID-19, like I have friends working at Google, and I was asking them to promote the videos that were presenting, that was discussing the COVID-19 pandemic in the right manner. And one of them eventually replied to me saying, okay, I'm willing to push for this, but what video should I recommend? And it was a difficult question. Like I really realized at this point that I've barely seen only a fraction of all of the videos on YouTube. It's very hard to know which one should be recommended. And it has to do with psychology, right? And I'm not an expert in psychology, even though I try as a science communicator to make sure that what I'm saying is going to be understood in the right manner, but this is very, very difficult in practice. And it's very, very important. In fact, the examples I've been showing you so far are all slightly misleading because in today's way of consuming information, most people are not actually searching for information. Today, there are more views on YouTube than searches on Google. More views on YouTube than searches on Google. And more often than not, 2 times out of 3, people watch a video on YouTube because the algorithm, the recommendation algorithm of YouTube, is telling them to watch this video. More often than not, people follow what an algorithm is telling them to watch. And so this algorithm is extremely important. It can really change the information diet of billions of people on Earth. YouTube, it represents 1 billion hours of watch time per day, and this was this statistic is from 2019 with the COVID-19 pandemic. It's guaranteed that this number is much bigger, actually. This represents, so if you take this number, this is half an hour for 2 billion people per day. And through repeated exposure, like we know from, if you're teaching, you know that the key to teaching is repetition. If you repeat something over and over, then eventually it becomes a lot easier for the other person to know what you mean. And also you can have, well, this is the whole idea of advertisements. If you repeat something, psychology, there are lots of psychological studies that show that you eventually like what you're exposed to a lot. This is like familiarity bias. And so this algorithm is extremely influential. It's extremely influential, and science YouTubers really know this. So you can see, well, I'm not going to detail too much, but you can really see the influence of the algorithm here. Most of the views of these videos come from recommendations of the algorithm. And in the current context, with a lot of disinformation, of all sorts of statistics that are misinterpreted, and like fake news as well, but you don't even need fake news to go into disinformation and misinformation. A lot of the misinformation can be based on factual statistics. Like if you're doing a bit of statistics, you know that statistics, it's so easy to lie with statistics, to manipulate the statistics, to cherry pick the statistics that are going to be misunderstood, misinterpreted, and that are going to lead to false understanding or wrong understanding of the world. And there are some concerning studies. So this is a studies that predate the COVID-19, and that has a model of how anti-vaccination views are spreading on Facebook, Facebook groups in particular. And they had this model, and according to their model that fits the data, if they project it into the future, they argue that the model predicts that anti-vaccination views will dominate in a decade. And so this is the case for vaccination, which is arguably a big issue, but you can apply this as well for all sorts of of issues that are more related to climate change and the environment. Just to insist on the fact that factual data can be extremely misleading, this is a plot that has been made by someone on Twitter about which news articles made the most views. And you can see that it's all factual, but just by highlighting, by giving a lot more emphasis on, for instance, side effects of the vaccines, or people who died after they took the vaccines, because of course, if you're vaccinating billions of people on Earth, some people will die shortly after having taken the vaccines, just because out of billions of people eventually, like a fraction of them will die, whether they took the vaccines or not. And just by giving a lot more emphasis on this case, you can completely distort the understanding of the effects of the vaccines for billions of consumers. And I also want to mention a little bit, but very shortly, the issues that have to do with mental health. I think we've seen this a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic. Actually, the World Health Organization has highlighted this as a major pandemic that was accompanying the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a big issue because if people feel lonely, if people feel depressed, if people feel unhappy, then it's much harder to get them to engage with more complex topics like climate change. You cannot solve climate change if people are not in a state of mind where they are going to be willing to fight against climate change. And all of this has to do a lot with news consumptions and just habits on social medias. So that's why I think here we have really, really a big problem. We have these algorithms that are having a gigantic impact on the world as a whole, and yet we barely think about the ethics of what they're doing. So how do we solve this? So I'm going to talk very briefly about the line of research that is trying to address this, and it all has to do with the idea of alignment. So the idea of alignment is to make sure that the algorithms are going to do what we want them to be doing. And in the age of machine learning, we don't program these algorithms anymore line by line. As you probably know, we give these algorithms a goal, and then the algorithm is trying to leverage this data, its data, to reach this goal. So typically, if you're the YouTube recommendation algorithm today, a lot of people from YouTube typically will say that this algorithm is maximizing for user engagement. And then they'll say that they cannot say much because of legal issues and stuff like this, which is always very frustrating. But that's how the algorithm is designed. And if you think about this, if the goal of the algorithm is not what you really want the algorithm to be doing, then the algorithm will necessarily have a lot of side effects. By trying to reach its goal, is going to have unwanted side effects on the whole population, which can have to do, for instance, with misinformation. So it's been argued by many researchers that if you want to make these algorithms more robustly beneficial for humanity as a whole, then you have to make sure that what they're optimizing, their goal, is going to be aligned with what we really want the algorithm to be optimizing. So with human preferences typically. So unfortunately today it's absolutely not the case. As I said, the YouTube algorithm is mostly optimizing for user engagement. And this has to do, of course, with the business model of these companies that are mostly based on ads and clicking on ads. And so if you can get the attention of billions of users, then you can get them to click on ads. So that's why attention is what's really important for these society, for these companies. What they want is more people spending more time on their platforms, because then they can sell more ads and it turns into revenues for them. So I highly recommend this book by Zeynep Tufekci, who's a world-class sociologist, and there's a lot more to say than what I'm saying here. Now, unfortunately, there's a big issue, and it's that ethics is complicated. As we all know, it's hard to agree, even with people that we agree a lot with, on precisely what should be, what is ethical. And if you turn to philosophers, then it turns out that philosophers are arguing a lot. So I've had collaborations with philosophers. I don't know if there's a philosopher here. Okay, so I can say anything I want about philosophers. Or maybe one person raised his hands. So my experience with philosophers, maybe it doesn't generalize, but I think it does, is that philosophers tend to like a lot things that are controversial, like especially when they're writing a paper. Like that's my experience, at least, and that makes things even harder. Like if you don't point out things that we agree on and you directly go to what we disagree on, then it makes things extremely hard. So philosophy is very hard in any case, and we're going to disagree a lot. But as a computer scientist myself, when I talk about complexity, I have notions of computational complexity in mind. In particular, there's one notion of complexity that I want to point out, which is called Solomonov complexity. You might have heard it as Kolmogorov complexity, or algorithmic complexity, sometimes it's called. So what do I mean by this? Complexity in this sense is the number of lines of code that you need to write to solve a task. So this is the Solomonov complexity of this task. And one thing we're arguing in our book with a colleague is that the complexity of ethics is necessarily large in this sense. Meaning that if you want to write down what an algorithm should do to be ethical, then you're going to end up writing a huge number of lines of code. And this is a big issue because, and by a big, like we argue a more than 500-page book. And this is a big issue because it's very hard to write a 500 pages of a book. And it's even harder to write a book that we will all agree on. Now you can ask, why would it be so hard? Why do we argue this? Well, there's a simple argument that we make is that if you want to write ethics, then probably at some point you're going to have to write that torturing cats is bad. I think this is something we can all agree on, hopefully. So I think that torturing cat is bad. But it's actually very hard to formalize this, to make sure that it's turned into an algorithm that actually understands that torturing cats is bad. And that, for instance, recommending videos of cat torture on YouTube is bad. Why is it hard? Well, because if you want to formalize this idea, then you need the algorithm to at least recognize a cat in an image. And this problem turns out to be very difficult. Like computer scientists have been trying to tell to a computer what a cat is for 70 years, essentially. And no one has ever succeeded. In fact, the only way we know today of designing an algorithm that's going to recognize cats is by doing machine learning. Like, we don't tell the computer what a cat is. We just show the computer a lot of images of cats. And at some point, well, we also design it to learn from the data. But at some point, like, the algorithm recognizes a cat. And in fact, you can look at the length of the code of these algorithms once they're trained. And there are typically they typically have millions of parameters, which corresponds to millions of lines of code. So you can argue that in order to recognize a cat, you need at least 1 million lines of code or something like this. And that's why if you want to write ethics, then you need 1 million lines of code, and 1 million lines of code is a book, a 500-page book. In fact, this is exactly Turing's argument for why we need to do machine learning. So, fun fact, machine learning was invented before artificial intelligence, technically. So this is a paper from 1950 from Turing. Well, he talked about learning machines, but we all know that's the same thing as machine learning. And his argument for why we need to do machine learning is exactly what I've just said. Like, he anticipated this notion of Solomonov complexity, and he said, yeah, we're going to have to write too many lines of code, and we humans cannot do it. We need to do machine learning in order to design an algorithm able of solving tasks such as recognizing cats or solving the imitation game, the Turing test. And so this means that we need data. If you want to solve ethics, arguably, if the conjecture about the complexity of ethics hold, then we're not going to be able to solve ethics by writing it down. We're going to have data to train algorithms that are going to understand ethics. And so this is called machine learning. And one thing that I think is underappreciated when we talk about machine learning is the fact that in machine learning, data is now controlling the algorithm. If you have a data-driven approach, it means that the data is determining what the algorithm is going to do. And that's a big issue. Well, I'm going to skip this. And that's a big issue because the data out there is not always of great quality. Like, I'll just skip this slide to argue that a lot of the data out there is of extremely bad quality. In fact, you need moderators to remove the very bad data. And by very bad data on YouTube, I'm talking about murder videos. There are murder videos on YouTube that have been scanned out by typically human moderators. And by the way, this is a job that has to be automated because it's traumatic. It's traumatic. Like you have a post-PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder among people who do this job. So it's an ethical urgency to automate this job. But unfortunately, it's very hard. It's a topic for another time. But what I want to stress is that there's a lot of bad data out there, and there's also a lot of sensitive data, including on public platforms such as Reddit or whatever. And this means that the algorithms that are going to learn from this data are going to have this sensitive data memorized in them, and they are going to be biased by the disinformation that is present in the training data. So typically on the left here is an algorithm that shows that you can recover sensitive information from an algorithm that's trained on public data, on data from Reddit, for instance. You can know like the address of someone, their phone number, and so on, because it's written somewhere on the web. And in fact, with like modern algorithms like GPT-2 or GPT-3, then you can just simply ask the algorithm, what is the address of that guy? And the algorithm is just going to give the answer, which is very scary. And on the right here is more about disinformation. There would be a lot more to say. I don't want to spend too much time on this. But essentially, you can have now these algorithms that are producing disinformation at scale. And so you can imagine like creating accounts that are going to repeat in a very customized manner some very bad disinformation. Just to stress how much data controls the algorithm. So this is a video, I guess it's not playing. But this is like someone using GPT-3. He starts his sentences by talking about two Muslims. And the algorithm constantly completes the sentences by talking about terrorism. And so this is very, very scary. So why? Again, it's because in its training data, which is like web data, there's a lot of association between Muslims and terrorism. And imagine that Google using this, and whenever someone's searching about Muslim, they could have an answer about terrorism on Google search, which would be terrifying. Yeah, so there would be a lot more to say. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip it. But yeah, you can Google CRC and Tay. That's also something very scary. I'm skipping this. I want to stress that if you want to make ethical algorithm, then you absolutely need a reliable, secured, large database with human preferences. At least that's the conclusion of the reasoning I've done here. So this leads me to Tournesol, which is the project that colleagues and I have started. It's been over a year now, but yeah, it's making progress. And the idea of Tournesol is to leverage data, the judgment, the ethical judgment of a large number of contributors to identify videos of top utility and to then know what YouTube should be recommending. So there are lots of things that can be done with this. You can audit these algorithms. You can, of course, ask YouTube to leverage this data to make more ethical recommendations. And the way we go about this is by letting contributors create an account and then judge out of 2 videos which one should be more largely recommended. So you just like go to the left if you think this is better, go to the right if this is better, and then you submit the rating. And what we really want with Tournesol is mostly to collect this data, to have a large database of different judgments about which videos are of utility. And we hope that using this data, then other researchers, which are public data, we hope that other researchers will try to leverage this data to design ethical algorithms. And if you want to go more into details, you can also provide more judgments about different criteria. So typically, the quality, the reliability of the information, whether it's an important topic, whether it's engaging, and so on. And then using this data, we have algorithms, learning algorithms that are robust, that compute scores for different videos based on the judgments of our contributors. And so here are the scores. And you have a plugin on YouTube that gives you the recommendations of Tournesol in your YouTube homepage. Yeah, I should say that Tournesol right now is offline because we've done a refactor of the code, but it should be available according to the developers in mid-September. Like I was given the date of 15 September, but it's not contractual, so please don't sue me if it's not the case. Yeah, so another thing that we're doing a lot on Tournesol is we're really trying to be transparent as much as possible and pedagogical in the way we present our platform. So we have a wiki that has a lot of information. And I really want to stress, because you're researchers, that there are a huge number of open research questions that are related to Tournesol and that need to be solved if you want to make Tournesol robust and safe and functional. So if you're interested in this, like we've written a technical white paper. It's on archive, so you can search Tournesol archive. Hopefully it can come up. And in particular, in this paper, we will list, I think, a dozen research questions that are currently open and that needs to be addressed. And actually, each one of them is like a whole research project in itself. So yeah, there's a lot for you to do if you're interested in this line of research. So just to conclude, Tournesol, so it's going to be available at tournesol.app. Tournesol.app is a collaborative project. It's open source. It's on Creative Commons license and so on. So we need contributors both to have data about human judgments, but as well on a technical level, both in developing the platforms, so implementations, but as well on a research level. There's a lot of mathematical questions in particular related to this, and as well like things that are more psychology or sociology questions. So if you want to know more, I'm making a series of videos on the topic on my channel, Science for All. we have the wiki, and there's this book that we already published with Mehdi Hamdi, who's a professor at Polytechnic and a researcher at Google. So we published this before Tournesol, so there's no mention of Tournesol in this book, but it has most of the ideas. And so in this book, we defend the two main theses. The first one is that making algorithms robustly beneficial has become absolutely urgent. Like we argue it's the main urgency today, partly because it is critical if you want to solve all the tasks, all the challenges like climate change. And the second thesis is that unfortunately it's not easy. Like it's extremely difficult, and we need top people like you helping us in this endeavor. But most importantly, the last thing is I want to stress is that like the journey of trying to think about better algorithms, more robustly beneficial algorithms, AI ethics, and so on. This has been a fantastic journey for me. Like this has been eye-opening and extremely thrilling on an intellectual level. So I cannot be excited enough about this. Like I'm really excited on a day-to-day basis about this huge endeavor. And I hope I've been able to share a little bit with you the enthusiasm that I have for this topic. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this intervention. Questions from the audience, please. And there are plenty. Yeah, let's start there.
Okay, so thank you for your very interesting talk. I was wondering how you, so about Tournesol, if I understand correctly, you're defining a rating based on user preferences. So how do you avoid echo chambers? So let's take, for example, that we go 30 years back. Someone publishes a video that challenges the status quo, for example, about climate change, saying that it is a real problem. How do you avoid for such a video to get buried? Well, it is maybe an interesting idea that needs to be challenged by and seen by many people to really emerge.
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's always this trade-off, if you think about this, between diversity and security. If you want to promote more diverse things, then you expose yourself to like potentially disinformation people pushing their content through. And so in any case, among the sliders, there are different sliders, and so some of them are going to value different things as well. So one of them is like the reliability of the information. I guess if you go with the scientific consensus, you would have this. But another one is like engaging and thought-provoking, for instance. And maybe with this, you're going to get this other kind of signal. So yeah, I guess this is our hope to identify this kind of video.
Thank you.
Yes, a question over here. Oh, yeah, okay. Yep, good.
My question is quite similar to the previous one. Some studies have shown that people who engage with more complex interfaces have usually a higher level of computer media literacy, which is usually linked with a higher level of education. Considering that, isn't there a risk that your feedback mechanism will be mostly used by people with a specific demographic profile and resulting in recommendation which will be aligned with their preferences, which is not necessarily the preferences of the whole community or necessarily aligned with the a kind of public utility definition that we could define?
Yeah, so I see two aspects of this question. The first one is like, how do you identify? So for instance, when the COVID-19 started, YouTube artificially pushed videos from the World Health Organization and like INSERM or things like this. INSERM, I'm not sure, but at least World Health Organization. And the issue is that these are very, sorry if there are people working in WHO here, but these are very boring videos, like talks of 1 hour by an expert and stuff like this. And so I think we need videos that are adapted to the viewer. So we need somehow to customize the recommendation. And the hope is that by having different sliders like this, different criteria, we can do this. So one of the sliders, for instance, is layman friendliness. Is it a content that's accessible for someone who knows nothing about the topic? Another one is engaging and thought-provoking, or another one is entertaining. So maybe people who are not like scientists will prefer something that is slightly misleading, but not too much, and but that is at least a bit entertaining. So like trying to use this to customize the recommendation is, I think, one interesting way to go. Now, there's another thing in your question, which I think is more critical and more challenging, is the fact that the set of people who will provide data on Tournesol is a biased subset of the population. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, for some topic, you do want the experts to somehow at least to consider at least more their judgments on the reliability of the information. But for other topics, it's a big issue. For instance, typically we expect, unfortunately on Tournesol, that most contributors will be men. Why? Because, well, these kinds of platforms are usually predominantly used by men. Typically, the recruitment will be done through my YouTube channel, typically, and the statistics of my channel are absolutely appalling. So 94% of people who watch my videos are men. And this is a bad bias, and it's a bias that you want to correct. So we also, like, I wish I could say we are investigating this question right now, but like we have too many other research questions right now. But if some of you are interested in this question, I've given already a few, some thoughts about how to debias the set of contributors, typically by giving more voting rights to women on our platform, because they are underrepresented compared to the rest of the population. But the trick is to do this in a principled manner. And typically, the idea is that if you can somehow see in your data that on a video, all women agree, and in a different manner than men agree, then arguably they are more representative, like what each of these women is saying, is more representative from the population of women. Whereas if on this topic, like there's a lot of diversity among women's judgments, then you cannot generalize well to the rest of women and so on. So yeah, so this gives a bit of hints at the kind of research I think is important to be doing today. I hope this answers the questions.
There's a question here.
Thank you for the presentation. I have maybe one remark and one question. So I wanted to know if there is any comparison between not having any algorithm of suggestion, like put only random things, and having a recommendation, because it's like, I think that maybe one problem is that we have this algorithm, and for example, yeah, so this is my first question, and the second question is that what the difference with this between aligned and preference? Like you speak about alignment, but I think people already watch what they prefer, and the algorithm is working now. If two of three people are watching, thanks to this algorithm. So yeah, maybe there is a lack. Maybe there is a moral into it, because for example, if I want to, if I disagree with government and I want to search for example, anti-pass, sanitary pass things, what is good according to you? Should I see something against the mask or something like this, or will you force me to watch things that is according to your ideas? So this is two questions.
Yeah, thanks. Two important questions. About the first one, do you need recommendation algorithms? The answer is emphatically yes. Why? Because it's been shown that, for instance, on WhatsApp, there's a huge amount of disinformation. If you recommend content randomly, then the content that is going to be exposed the most is like the one that there are more of. So it's easy for disinformation campaigns to attack a random suggestion by just producing more and more of disinformation. In fact, if you take one video of YouTube randomly, it's going to be horrible. Like, there are horrible pedophile videos that are still on YouTube. Like, it's very hard for YouTube to fight against this. So it's very dangerous. Like, same with Telegram. There's a huge amount of disinformation on Telegram, and there's no recommendation algorithm on Telegram. So recommendation algorithm is a way to moderate as well the content, and it's very important. Okay, the second question was more about about preferences, and which I will distinguish with what I'm going to call volition. So it's sometimes used by philosophers. Is the idea of what you would prefer to prefer, as opposed to preferences which are your immediate preferences. To give a concrete example, I have a big addiction to YouTube, to football videos on YouTube. So I know when I click on a football video on YouTube that there's a non-zero probability that I'm still going to be watching football videos on YouTube 1 hour later. And when I see, and it's the same with other kind of addictions, like if you think about eating sugar or things like this, like you know that if you click on this, then you're going to regret it. And you would prefer, like when you watch, like you see this thumbnail, you want to click on it, but somehow you would prefer not to want this. You would prefer not to have these preferences. So this is called sometimes a preference of second order. It's not what you prefer in the moment, it's what you would prefer to prefer. And arguably, it would be better to prefer what we want to prefer than to prefer what we do prefer. So that's also an effort, and that's not something we want to study. So typically, there's a project in collaboration with the sociologists. We want to see how people rate these videos and what they think about how they rated this video a few days later, and if they evolve in the way they rate the videos. It's about trying to get the more conscious part of your brain to really think and engage with the question of what it should be watching. And I would like to recommend this technique that I've been using a lot, is that on all social medias, you can tell the recommendation algorithm that you can tell it not to recommend you some topics anymore, some contents anymore. So usually it's on the top right, you have the options, and you can say, I'm not interested in this kind of topics. So now on YouTube, whenever I see a football video, I tell to the algorithm, I don't want to be exposed to this video. Same on Twitter. Whenever I see something angry or aggressive, I tell Twitter, I don't want to be exposed to this kind of content. And this way, I'm getting much closer to what I would prefer to prefer when I'm on these platforms. So I think there's a lot of exercise to be done about this. Of course, disagreement there will remain, and it's a difficult question about how much should I want to be exposed to alternative views than mine, but at least we can make some progress by moving towards more what we would prefer to prefer, I would argue.
Thanks a lot. Unfortunately, we are running out of time already, 5 minutes overlay. So maybe we will, I know that Lee is there until tomorrow as well. He will also join tonight at the Louvain event. So it's all occasions to discuss with him further. Jan Tobias, I don't know if you have a last question or if...
I would have a last question, but we can also take it offline. Okay. Yeah, I think it's then time for lunch.
I have one as well, so we will discuss this. later on. But so do not hesitate to put on Teams on the speaker additional question. Just feel free to add all your questions over there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.